Good evening. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would like to start this episode by thanking all the members who are joining us this evening. So much of what we do at the Frick is due to your support. So thank you for joining us. And I would also like to remind everyone that until the 15th of June, if you join the Frick as a member, you will receive an extra 2 months for free. So I hope you will join us and you will come and visit Frick Madison. We start in the enamels room at 1 East 70th Street, and we looked at a number of works in this room in past episodes of Cocktails with a Curator. We looked at the Piero della Francescas, and we looked at the Paolo Veneziano. And today, I would like to talk about the painting that you see here on the left, between two of the Pieros, and that is now at Frick Madison, on the opposite side as Paolo Veneziano's Coronation of the Virgin. And here you see the two paintings on each side of the door leading into the room with our Indian carpets. This is a work from the early 15th century, probably from around the early 1420s. And it is one of the very few works at the Frick that still maintains mostly its original frame. Except from a few parts of the frame which were later replaced, the main structure of the frame of this picture is original. And at the very bottom, you see a detail here on the right. The frame bears the signature of the artist, Gentile da Fabriano. So this is a signed work by a very interesting 15th century Italian painter. And it represents the Virgin and Child surrounded by two saints. The painting is very beautifully described in the main monograph on Gentile da Fabriano, which is a book that was published in 1982, and it's a catalog raisonné of Gentile da Fabriano. And the author of the volume describes the work and writes very beautifully. Combined with an insistent corporeality are the livelier, less poignant expressions of the Virgin and Child, set off by the fervent devotion of saints in the flower of youth. The way the child's attention is diverted by the captive bird, symbol of Christ's passion, is a particularly felicitous idea. No less ingenious is the way space is defined by the painted ledge, by arbitrarily cropping off the foreground figures and by carefully describing the planes of the throne. The subtle displacement of the halos in order to free a profile again indicates Gentile's concerns. So this is a wonderful way to look formally at this picture. And this was written in the early 1980s by Keith Christensen, who published a book on Gentile da Fabriano and is to this day the main expert in the world on Gentile. Keith Christensen is a friend and colleague at the Metropolitan Museum and the head of the European Paintings Department. And this month he will be retiring from the Met. And therefore I would like to dedicate this episode on Gentile to Keith. I am drinking a Cosmopolitan, a very famous cocktail, of course, made out of vodka, triple sec, and cranberry juice, garnished with lemon and a little bit of lemon juice. And of course, Cosmopolitan is a word that applies, as we will see, both to Gentile da Fabriano, but also to Keith. Cheers. Gentile da Fabriano came, as the name suggests, from the town of Fabriano. A small town in the Marche region in central eastern Italy. And Gentile grew up and was probably trained to begin with there, but he actually ended up spending most of his career traveling across the whole of Italy. He is truly a cosmopolitan artist by the standards of 15th century Italy. And he is an artist, a painter who works in Florence, in Tuscany, in Venice, in Rome, in Siena, in Orvieto, in a number of cities all over the Italian peninsula. He was born around 1370 and died in 1427, but was really active for the 3 decades, the earliest decades of the 15th century. And we first hear of him in the early 1400s in Venice. here are some of his works. This is one of his earlier, largest surviving altarpieces. This is the polyptych of the Valle Romita, which shows at its center the Virgin being crowned, an iconography, as we've discussed before, that is very common in the 14th and 15th century in Italy. And this is now in the Brera Gallery in Milan. Another work from slightly later, from the 1420s, is at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And this is one of the most beautiful Gentile da Fabrianos in the United States. And again, it shows the coronation of the Virgin. And for those of you who remember the episode on Paolo Veneziano a few weeks ago, here is the same exact iconography: Christ crowning the Virgin, surrounded by music-making angels. And thinking back to the Paolo Veneziano, which was painted several decades before, you can see how Gentile builds on previous examples, but creating a very, very different scene, and a scene that is particularly wonderful because of all these incredible textiles that he shows, the cloth of honor in the background and the outfits of both the Virgin and Christ. This was actually originally part of a double-sided standard that was carried in procession, in religious processions, and the other side of it shows the stigmatization of St. Francis, and this was made for a Franciscan church. And the opposite side, this one, is now in the Fondazione Magnani Rocca outside of Parma in Italy. The most famous work that survives by Gentile da Fabriano is no doubt this grand and wonderful Adoration of the Magi, which is in the Uffizi in Florence, an incredibly rich scene, so wonderfully composed with these elegant figures with incredible textiles and details in various metals, in gold and silver, but also the extensive use of pastiglia, which is effectively raised gesso that is then gilded and gives a three-dimensional effect to some of the decorations of this extraordinary altarpiece. At the end of his life, Gentile is at work in Rome, and we know that he is frescoing one of the four main basilicas of Rome, St. John in Lateran, and he works there in the footsteps of another great artist, Pisanello, who had left his fresco cycle and finished. Unfortunately, all we have of this fresco cycle is this 17th century drawing, which gives us a sense of what the frescoes look like. They were entirely destroyed, unfortunately, in the 17th century when the basilica was extensively refurbished by the architect Borromini. Gentile is one of the great artists of what we today know as the International Gothic. And International Gothic is one of those art historical terms, which of course was coined in the late 19th century, but it is a helpful term, even though none of the artists obviously living during the end of the 14th and the first half of the 15th century would have identified themselves as being an artist of the International Gothic movement. That is a label we art historians place on these artists later on. But it very effectively describes the artistic currents and exchanges that are happening over this period, as I say, between the end of the 14th and the early 15th century across Europe, starting in Burgundy in France, but reaching England, Prague, Italy. And many artists like Gentile, who traveled extensively, looked at courtly works that had arrived in the courts of Italy and Milan, but also in Venice and Rome and a number of other cities from other areas of Europe. And just to show you one of the great works of what we call the International Gothic, here is the Wilton Diptych in London, a painting which is still very mysterious in a number of ways. We don't know actually if it was painted by an English artist, a French artist, a Bohemian artist, even an Italian artist. I mean, there's been a number of endless suggestions as to who may have painted this. It's quite likely to have been painted by a British artist, but clearly someone who is looking at a number of other artists active all over Europe. So Gentile is part of this current, and he is clearly an international artist, even though, as far as we know, he never leaves the borders of the Italian peninsula. Hence my choice of a Cosmopolitan cocktail today. Now, the Virgin and Child at the Frick shows the Virgin enthroned. Again, notice the wonderful details of the fabrics. The sort of orange, yellowish, very bright cloth of honor wrapped around the throne of the Virgin, the blue mantle of the Virgin over gold and red dress. The wonderful detail of the veil over the head of the Virgin, which is that same blue mantle, but reversed, showing this darker blue, blackish color with gold polka dots. The child in her arms, and as I mentioned in Keith's quote, the child is distracted by the bird that he is holding on a leash, effectively. And the little bird is a symbol predicting what will happen in the Passion of Christ. Here is the beautiful head of the Virgin, very elegantly painted. And again, looking at a number of models from the Italian peninsula and abroad from the rest of Europe. And here again is the Christ child with the little bird flying out of the picture. The details of the fabric are absolutely wonderful, and there are different techniques in terms of how the gold is used, different punch marks that, like the sort of little flower that goes all the way around the edges of the mantle of the Virgin. But here you really see in this detail the differences in which, the different ways in which Gentile is treating fabrics and gold. Now, the two saints that accompany this work are clearly identifiable, in part through their attributes, in part through the inscriptions at the bottom of the frame, which very handily tell us who the two saints are. On the left is Saint Lawrence. And the Latin inscription, of course, Laurentius is the Latin name for Lawrence, clearly identifies him under the saint. Again, wearing this extraordinary ecclesiastical vestment, beautifully painted. Remember the vestments, the dresses of the Getty coronation of the Virgin. It is really wonderful to see how Gentile is playing with different examples of textiles in his paintings. Saint Lawrence was a 3rd century early Christian deacon, saint, and martyr, and he was famously put to death to be burnt alive on a gridiron. And so what you see on the left, just towards the edge of the frame, is the metal gridiron of Lawrence. And of course, I'm showing you here a much later example of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. This is by the young Bernini, now in Florence, but this much more visually represents the heroic death as a martyr of Lawrence, burned on the gridiron. And this was a sculpture which was made for Florentine patrons of Bernini. The other saint on the right is identified by two symbols, a sword and a palm, which is usually a symbol of martyrdom. And it is identified again by name in the frame, Saint Julian, Saint Julianus. And Julian, here you see him again with the symbol of the sword in a Taddeo Gaddi painting now at the Met, is a 4th century saint, Julian the Hospitaller. The story of Julian is a very romantic and tragic story, which, of course, was first told in the Golden Legend of Jacobus da Voragine, but later taken up by a number of authors and writers. And most famously, in 1877, Flaubert, the French writer, writes his three tales, one of which is the story of Saint Julian. And it is a tragic story which has echoes of classical tragedy, and in many ways echoes, to some degree, the story of Oedipus Rex. Julian comes from a wealthy family, and he is told as a young man that he will end up killing his parents. And so this prophecy scares him. Julian flees his parents' house, moves far away, marries his wife, and years later, he goes out hunting, and upon his return from the hunt, he goes back to his house early to surprise his wife, and he finds a woman and a man in his bed, and he assumes they are his wife with another man. taken by invincible anger, he kills them both on the spot, only to then leave the house and realize that his wife is outside talking to friends. And his wife tells him that his parents have come to visit, and they were tired, and she has given them their bed to sleep in. And so, of course, the prophecy of Julian killing his parents takes place. Julian at that point abandons his family life and leads a saintly life subsequently. The slight issue with this representation of Julian is that, of course, the sword is a typical symbol of Julian because of the murder of his parents, but the palm of martyrdom does not really apply to Julian the Hospitaller, because Julian was not a martyred saint. So why is he with this second attribute? And this may be, we don't really know, but maybe to do with some confusion between Saint Julian the Hospitaller and a second Saint Julian of Antioch, who was also a saint in the 4th century, a Christian saint, who was actually a martyr and is also known as Saint Julian the Martyr. He was killed by the pagans in a rather sort of gruesome way. He was put in a sack full of scorpions and vipers and thrown into the sea. So it may be that Gentile is somewhat conflating the two saints. We're not entirely sure. Part of the problem with this painting is that we don't actually know who it was painted for and where it was painted for. Was it something done for Fabriano, the hometown of Gentile? Was it done for a patron in Florence? Both Saint Lawrence and Saint Julian are very common saints in Tuscany and central Italy, and they are often venerated by different patrons. So do the names Julian and Lawrence have something to do with the patronage of the work? Most likely, but we still don't know what that is. The painting first appears in 1846, so quite late, in the collection of this man, Albert Duc de Broglie. And the Duc de Broglie was twice Prime Minister of France, an aristocrat and collector. And the painting was in his collection in Paris, and only later, from his descendants and going for a number of other owners, in 1966, the Frick collection acquires the work. So again, it's one of those gold grounds that was purchased later by the museum after Henry Clay Frick died. This provenance of the picture is a particularly appropriate one for the Frick, in a very curious connection to the Frick, because the Duc de Broglie, Albert, was actually the brother of the Comtesse of Sainville, who's represented here in the famous portrait by Ingres at the Frick. She was actually born Louise de Broglie, and she was Albert's sister. So I always think with some fondness about the idea of the Comtesse of Sainville knowing this Gentile da Fabriano in the collection of his brother. And of course, the Broglie-Sainville family were great patrons of Ingres, because also the Duke's wife, the Princesse de Broglie, was portrayed by Ingres, and this is her great portrait at the Metropolitan Museum, also in New York. So the Gentile da Fabriano, in a way, weaves different stories from the Frick collection, and it is extraordinary that both this painting belonging to the Duc de Broglie and the portrait of his sister ended up in New York at different times, and actually for very different reasons, and acquired, as I say, at different times. I hope you will all come to Frick Madison, visit us, and look at the Gentile da Fabriano surrounded by other works from the 14th and 15th century. Here you see it with the Piero della Francescas on a side. And of course, these are painted several decades later, also for central Italy. And many of these connections can be drawn by looking at the pictures at Frick Madison. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Cheers.